You're listening to Renewal by the Book, a Quran tafsir podcast based on Imam Al-Ghazali's Ihya. This podcast is brought to you by Seekers Hub. This Ramadan, our goal is to raise $75,000 in monthly donations to build a global Islamic seminary so that dedicated students all over the world can complete their journeys and become Islamic scholars. You can help them by becoming a monthly donor at seekershub.org/donate.
Bismillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man walah. Allahumma salli ala sayyidina wa maulana Muhammad, salatan tunajjina biha min jami'il ahwali wal afat, wa tuzakkina biha min jami'il ahwa'i wal shahawat, wa tutahhiruna biha min jami'is sayyi'at, wa taqdi lana biha jami'al hajat, wa tarfa'una biha a'la ad-darajat, wa tuballighuna biha aqsa al-ghayat. من جميع الخيرات في الحياة وبعد الممات. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. I have two ayat that I was hoping to discuss. One of them connected to dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the other one connected to dua. I don't know if we're going to have time. So which one do you prefer we start with? Dhikr or dua? Dhikr? Dhikr? Khairan. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Kahf, and it's a beautiful ayah because we read that every week. Allah Azza wa Jal says, وَاصْبِرْ نَفْسَكَ مَعَ الَّذِينَ يَدْعُونَ رَبَّهُمْ بِالْغَدَاةِ وَالْعَشِيِّ يُرِيدُونَ وَجْهَهُ ولا تعد عيناك عنهم تريد زينة الحياة الدنيا ولا تطع من أغفلنا قلبه عن ذكرنا واتبع هواه وكان أمره فرطا. Allah Azza wa Jal says, وَاصْبِرْ نَفْسَكَ. So gird your nafs in patience with those that يَدْعُونَ رَبَّهُمْ, those that call upon their Lord, بِالْغَدَاةِ وَالْعَشِيِّ, in the morning and in the evening, يُرِيدُونَ وَجْهَ, desirous of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's countenance, desirous of Allah Azza wa Jal. وَاصْبِرْ نَفْسَكَ. So, as we said earlier, it's difficult for the nafs to be in dhikr of Allah Azza wa Jal, because it means going against the energy of the nafs. The nafs likes to go downhill. It likes that which is easy, comfortable. And to keep it focused on Allah Azza wa Jal is difficult. So that's like going uphill, right? Building up potential energy. So Allah Ta'ala says, wasbir, because it takes sabr in order to be in dhikr of Allah Azza wa Jal. To make the commitment to do that requires in me sabr. And to do that, مَعَ الَّذِينَ يَدْعُونَ رَبَّهُمْ, keep yourselves with those people. The people of invocation and remembrance of Allah Azza wa Jal. Right? Because when we are with people, depending on the hearts of those people, so too will our hearts become inclined to do and to be. The nature of the heart is that it draws, it inhales from the states of others. And if we are around people whose objective is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whose objective is nearness to Allah Azza wa Jal, we will imbibe their states. We will imbibe their resolve for that. And these are people who call upon their Lord بِالْغَدَاةِ وَالْعَشِيِّ, in morning and evening, يُرِيدُونَ وَجْهَ, very beautiful. That is, they are murids. What is a murid? A murid is one that desires from the verb arada. Arada yuridu murid. Someone who wants, someone who desires, someone who orients themselves on a particular goal and strives for that. So yuriduna, what do they want? And irada, as we said earlier, remember, it is a feature of the qalb. The qalb has three roles, right? To know, to feel, to desire. So this irada of these people is for Allah Azza wa Jal. They're desirous of Allah Azza wa Jal. Yuriduna wajha. They're desirous of His countenance. In the sense that they want Allah Azza wa Jal and want Him purely. وَلَا تَعْدُ عَيْنَاكَ عَنْهُمْ. And don't allow your eyes to go beyond them. تُرِيدُ زِينَةَ الْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا. Desirous of the zina of dunya. So don't allow the eyes of your heart. Right? Don't allow the eyes and the vision of your heart to traverse beyond them and their focus and their goal, those people who desire Allah Azza wa Jal. And instead, don't allow your heart to swerve towards another irada. The other irada is what? Zinat al-hayatid dunya. The zina. So what is zina in Arabic? Zina is the external, the cosmetic, the superficial. Because the nature of dunya is fleeting, it's passing, it's temporary, right? It doesn't last. So it's like superficial beauty. So don't allow the eyes of your heart, don't allow your irada to swerve away from seeking Allah Azza wa Jal in being constant in dhikr, morning and evening, almost like the two ends of the day and everything in between. Another way of saying all the time. Right? Don't allow your irada to move away from that noble and sublime goal, and instead choose that which is passing, fleeting, temporary, the zina, just something superficial and cosmetic, that when you wipe it away, you see the reality of what dunya is. وَلَا تُطِعْ, and this is what I wanted to focus on, وَلَا تُطِعْ مَنْ أَغْفَلْنَا قَلْبَهُ عَنْ ذِكْرِنَا. And do not obey. وَلَا تُطِعْ مَنْ أَغْفَلْنَا قَلْبَهُ عَنْ ذِكْرِنَا. The one whom we have made heedless, the one whose heart we have made heedless, عَنْ ذِكْرِنَا, of my remembrance, of our remembrance, وَاتَّبَعَ هَوَاهُ, and then follows their hawa, وَكَانَ أَمْرُهُ فُرُطًا, and then their affair is excessive. This ayah is very powerful because it speaks to the consequences of a lack of dhikr of Allah Azza wa Jal in very real ways. So Allah Ta'ala says, don't obey. In a general sense, anyone. Don't follow anyone. Anyone could include anyone. Scholars, students, teachers, friends, colleagues. Man aghfalna qalbahu, whose heart we have made heedless of our remembrance. So the heart is the seat of remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And now the consequences of not being in remembrance of Allah ta'ala, which are called ghafla. So ghafla is heedlessness. So ghafla is any time that I am not remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Anytime I'm not in remembrance of Allah Azza wa Jal, at some level, then I'm in a state of ghafla, that's the opposite of dhikr. And the danger of ghafla, Allah Azza wa Jal explains to us, is as follows. وَاتَّبَعَ هَوَاهُ. So there's a connection here that Allah Ta'ala wants me to see. There's a connection between the qalb and the nafs, because the hawa or caprice, the seed of that and the locus of that is in the nafs. and action. وَكَانَ أَمْرُهُ, then his matter, his action, his matter in general, inclusive of action, كَانَ أَمْرُهُ فُرُطًا, it is excessive, it is extreme. Right? So if I'm in a state of ghafla with my heart, then the consequence of that is that my heart is going to be affected by other than Allah Azza wa Jal. In this case, affected by my nafs, my lower self. You can think about it as the lower self almost sort of suffocating and gaining a strangled hold over the heart because of it not being in remembrance of Allah Ta'ala. So Allah Ta'ala says, what will happen is, that person who is not in dhikr of Allah Ta'ala is going to follow their hawa. And their hawa in particular here, hawa as juxtaposed to shahwa, hawa tends to be ideological in nature or philosophical, right? Meaning the ideas that I have of good and bad, of right and wrong, of unethical and ethical, of virtuous and not virtuous, those tend to be hawa. And shahwa tends to be the carnal desires or the sensual desires. So if I'm not in dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the consequence of that, the heart not being enlightened by the light of knowledge of Allah Azza wa Jal, not experiencing tawheed wijdani, not desiring Allah Azza wa Jal, the consequence of that is وَاتَّبَعَ هَوَاهُ, that he follows his hawa. That is that not connecting to Allah Azza wa Jal as the Rabb, I make something else my Rabb. What do I make my Rabb? Myself. I make myself. Because the nafs is the greatest idol. The greatest idol is the nafs itself inside of me. So when I'm not connecting to Allah Azza wa Jal, the nafs becomes my beloved. I'm in ibadah. Remember we said ibadah is my attachment to my beloved. So the nafs becomes close to me, beloved to me. My ideas, my notions, my ideological inclinations become beautiful to me. That becomes like a zina to me. And then I follow what I deem to be good, bad, right, wrong, moral, immoral. And as a consequence of that, وَكَانَ أَمْرُهُ فُرُطًا, then my matter, amruhu in general, the way I think, excessive, extreme, dangerous. The way I feel, excessive, extreme, dangerous. The way I act, excessive, extreme, problematic, exaggerated, imbalanced, unbalanced. Are you with me? And that's all the consequence of what? Lack of dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it's clear in the ayah. No? It's clear, beautiful in the ayah. The consequences of that. The consequences of ghafla in the impact and strengthening of my nafs and the control of my nafs over me, and how that expresses itself in my actions, in my deeds, in my thoughts, in my interactions, in my strategy, in my planning, in my vision, in my aims. Whether I am a student, at work, teacher, a scholar, social activist. Let's look at that for a second. I'm doing social work, social activism in some sense, political activism in some sense. And I'm working. This ayah tells me that if I'm not in dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala while I work, as I work, during my work, in the different ways that one can be in dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if I'm not doing that, I'm going to be in ghafla. And when I'm in ghafla, the impact of my nafs over me is going to be magnified and intensified. And then my hawa are going to take control over me, are going to be beautified for me and to me in some way. And then I'm going to think and act and do in an extreme way. And that extreme, that has a range, obviously. Some things are more extreme than others. Some actions, some thoughts, some planning, some philosophies are more extreme than other. But I'm prone to extreme action and work and activity to the extent of my ghafla of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and all of that because of the lack of dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in my life. At every level, this is a universal principle. Allah ta'ala is elaborating for us in Surat Al-Kahf, and that is one of the enduring themes of the surah. The idea of what is lasting, what is temporal. And the zina of dunya, that word occurs multiple times in Surah Al-Kahf, like that. The zinatul hayatid dunya. It occurs multiple times. And Allah Ta'ala is stating this as a universal principle for me, about the importance of dhikr of Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala, and the dangerous consequences of not giving primacy to dhikr, and not being in a state of dhikr of Allah Azza wa Jal, and the consequences of that in producing extreme behavior. Because furuta, tafrit and ifrat, to do too little, to do too much. So the point here is that I'm not balanced. I'm not living a sacred, balanced mean in my life, in my thoughts, in my feelings, in my actions. I'm swaying this way or that way, but in either case, it's not balanced and it's harmful, because the sacred mean is the beneficial way. Right? If my heart is connected to Allah Azza wa Jal, along with other conditions of sacred knowledge and so forth, then I will be able to act and interact in a way to produce benefit and maslahah and good and welfare. But if I'm not in dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even though I think I'm doing good, and the example we gave is in social work or political activism, I think I'm doing good because I could be in da'wah. I could be doing da'wah, right? And so, just by virtue of it being da'wah, doesn't mean it's ibadah. Just by virtue of it being in da'wah, doesn't mean it's dhikr. Unless my heart is in dhikr of Allah Ta'ala and I'm making an effort to do that. Just because it has the trappings of an Islamic institution doesn't mean I'm in dhikr of Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala. And on the contrary, sometimes that's definitely not the case. Simply because I'm doing Islamic work, quote unquote, I assume it's all dhikr. It doesn't work like that. And when I'm not in dhikr of Allah Ta'ala, then my actions, as we said, my feelings, my planning, my thinking, my reaction to others is going to be extreme. And extreme here means it will not produce the necessary welfare and benefit. On the contrary, what will happen is, because, and oftentimes we're unaware of the impact of our nafs upon us in terms of hawa, and we think we're doing good and we're not, and the root cause of that, I remind myself and you, is the lack of remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in producing stability and balance in the way that I feel, in the way that I see, in the way that I do. So that is a verse that very beautifully speaks to some of the themes that we discussed in dealing with dhikr. And lil-asaf, fortunately, we don't have time for the second one, but depending on the material tomorrow, perhaps we can speak about the consequences of lack of dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and what that indicates of me and my feelings, and the dangers that produces in me when I turn away from dua to Allah Azza wa Jal. May Allah make us of those who listen and follow the best of what they hear. May Allah Azza wa Jal make us of those who truly appreciate and feel the importance of His remembrance and struggle for that. And may Allah Ta'ala make us of those who He gives the gift of the sweetness of His remembrance in whatever they do. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you for listening to this Seekers Hub podcast. To listen to the rest of our shows, please visit seekershub.fm. You can also subscribe to our weekly email newsletter called Compass, where we'll send the best of Seekers Hub's content straight to your inbox every single week. To get on the list, visit seekershub.org/compass.